Welcome to the Psychology Undergrad. Come on in, grab a seat, get comfortable, and you might actually want to grab a highlighter for this one.
Yeah, we are incredibly glad you can make it to our study session today.
Definitely, because if you are prepping for the exact same cross-cultural psychology midterms that we are, or, if you are simply joining us because human behavior and the bizarre ways we structure our lives just fascinates you, you have definitely found the right table in the library.
For sure. We have a massive stack of research papers in front of us covering decades of data, and we really need to get through them systematically today.
We do, and processing this volume of academic literature requires a ton of mental energy. And as psychology undergrads, we know the #1 predictor of cognitive function, emotional regulation, and memory consolidation is sleep.
Right. If you are chronically sleep deprived, your hippocampus basically just goes on strike, and none of this data is going to stick for the exam.
Exactly. Speaking of which, we also want to let you know this show is sponsored by Cozy Earth. Get a 21% discount promo code, PSYC101. Head to https.cuzero.com/discount PSYC101. We want to promote their bamboo sheet set that will help give you the best night of your sleep, and we know that sheets can be expensive for undergrads, so the discount will help you get 21% off.
And getting that memory consolidation is so vital because the concepts we are tackling today are really dense, and they're going to challenge some deeply ingrained societal narratives.
They really are. So our primary topic for this deep dive into the source material is the psychology of marriage. Specifically, we're analyzing it through a rigorous cross-cultural lens.
Right. We are putting two primary models under the microscope today. First, love-based marriages, which the literature defines as marriages of free choice based purely on romantic attachment. And second, arranged marriages, where family and social structures essentially dictate the pairing.
But the moment we define those two terms, we have to pause. We have to confront this massive Western bias that permeates not just our everyday conversations, but honestly, it often bleeds into psychological research itself.
It absolutely does.
Because if you grew up in the United States or Western Europe, you were handed a cultural script. And that script frames romantic love as the absolute non-negotiable prerequisite for a legitimate marriage.
Right. The prevailing narrative suggests that if a union isn't sparked by a profound, individualized romance, it must be inherently oppressive or tragically flawed or just destined for misery.
Yeah, we are socially conditioned to view arranged marriages through this intense lens of skepticism, assuming they just strip individuals of all their agency.
But our job today isn't to validate cultural folklore. It is to look at the empirical evidence. We have to ask, does the data actually support the assumption that romantic love produces the most stable, satisfying, and functional marriages?
And to answer that, we are synthesizing findings from 3 monumental cross-cultural studies today.
Yes. We are looking at Madisel and Benshoff's 2008 data comparing couples in India and the United States. We are dissecting Hortoksu's 2007 longitudinal style study on the Turkish family life cycle.
And finally, we are analyzing Reagan, Lacanpaul, and Angliano's 2012 research, which focuses heavily on the Indian American diaspora.
So the overarching mission for our session is threefold. First, we need to operationalize the variables, meaning we have to define exactly how psychologists measure a happy marriage in the first place.
Right. Second, we will compare the actual marital outcomes across these vastly different cultural landscapes.
And third, we are going to challenge the assumptions you might hold about how love develops, how partnerships are sustained, and what structural supports are actually required to keep two humans together over a lifetime.
But before we can interpret a single data point from those studies, we have to lay down the theoretical framework. The researchers use a foundational cultural spectrum to contextualize all of these behaviors, which is the individualistic versus collectivistic spectrum.
Exactly, because if you don't understand where a society falls on this spectrum, the data is just going to look like noise.
Totally. To make this stick for the exam, let's use a metaphor. Think of an individualistic culture as a solo jazz artist.
I like that.
And then think of a collectivistic culture as a massive symphony orchestra.
That perfectly captures the structural difference. Let's break that down. In an individualistic culture, which dominates the West, the societal priority is that solo jazz artist. The entire cultural apparatus is designed to maximize personal identity, self-actualization, independence, and the pursuit of individual goals.
Yeah, so when a solo artist approaches marriage, their framework dictates that they must find a partner who completes their personal psychological landscape.
Right. The ideal spouse is someone who facilitates their self-expression and fulfills their unique emotional needs. Romantic love is basically the improvisational tune they are playing, and personal choice is paramount.
But a collectivistic culture operates on an entirely different set of priorities. In places like India or various cultures across the Middle East and Asia, you are looking at the symphony orchestra.
Yes, the overriding focus there is on group cohesiveness. It's about the continuity of the extended family, social harmony, and the fulfillment of collective obligations.
You are not improvising a solo. You are assigned a specific chair in the violin section, and your primary job is to play your part flawlessly in service of a much larger, coordinated piece of music. Group identity and familial stability are heavily rewarded over individual self-discovery.
And if we pull the lens back even further and look at how these frameworks intersect with morality and religion, the contrast becomes incredibly stark.
How so?
Well, in a collectivist society, an arranged marriage is rarely just a practical calculation of resources. It is frequently viewed as a sacramental, ritualized union. It is anchored in profound moral duty, filial piety, and strict adherence to religious tradition. The marriage is a pact between families, ancestors, and the community.
Which fundamentally changes how these cultures view the Western concept of dating. In a collectivist framework, prioritizing your own fleeting, dopamine-driven romantic feelings over the generational stability and traditions of your family is often viewed as incredibly selfish.
Right. The source material actually notes that many non-Western cultures perceive marrying purely for passionate love as superficial, erratic, and inherently dangerous.
Dangerous because, from their perspective, building a lifelong institution on the foundation of a neurochemical rush is a recipe for disaster. Feelings inevitably fluctuate, right? Whereas moral duty, religious covenants, and family bonds are designed to be permanent.
And when you look at the divorce rates in highly individualistic Western countries, which researchers like Badams highlighted in 2013, that collectivist critique carries substantial weight.
Yeah, because if romantic love is the solitary pillar supporting the entire weight of the marriage, the structure is incredibly vulnerable. When the romance naturally ebbs, as human physiology dictates it will, the marriage often collapses.
Exactly. It collapses because there is no external scaffolding. There's no extended family intervention, no binding moral obligation to the community to hold it upright.
And that structural vulnerability is exactly what we need to keep in mind as we dive into the first major section of our material today, which is the spectrum of mate selection.
Let's get into it.
When I was reviewing the background literature for this unit, a statistic from Walker and colleagues in 2001 really stopped me in my tracks. Arranged marriages aren't just practiced by a significant portion of the modern global population. They actually possess a historical lineage stretching back roughly 50,000 years.
From an evolutionary psychology perspective, 50,000 years is profound. It means that for the overwhelming majority of human existence, the methodology for selecting mates was heavily influenced, if not entirely dictated, by kin networks, tribal elders, and the immediate social group.
Survival depended on clan alliances, resource pooling, and maintaining genetic diversity within small populations, none of which could be left to the whims of individual teenage infatuation.
Right. The modern Western paradigm where you evaluate strangers on a digital app, go on a few isolated dates, develop an emotional attachment, and then commit to a lifelong partnership completely independent of your family's vetting process.
It's a massive historical anomaly.
It really is. It is arguably the most radical shift in human mating behavior in our species' history. But as we study this, the literature warns us not to fall into a reductive binary.
Yeah, we tend to conceptualize mate selection as either 100% free choice, romantically serendipitous union, or 100% forced, oppressive, arranged marriage. But the reality is that mate selection exists on a highly nuanced spectrum, and the boundaries are increasingly blurring in the modern era.
To map that spectrum accurately for the test, we need to utilize Stopes, Rowe, and Cochrane's 1990 model. They developed a comprehensive typology of arranged marriages.
I actually made a mnemonic for this so we can shorthand it as the TMC spectrum. That's total, modified, and cooperative.
That is perfect. Let's clearly define each point on that TMC spectrum. The T represents the traditional pattern. This aligns closely with the prevailing Western stereotype.
Right. In a strictly traditional arranged marriage, parents and extended family elders assume total control over the selection process. The individuals being matched might not interact at all until the wedding ceremony.
The families are negotiating a complex merger based on economic standing, religious compatibility, caste or social status, and strategic family alliances. The individual's romantic preference is entirely irrelevant to the calculus.
Then, moving along the spectrum, we encounter the M, which is the modified traditional pattern. In this dynamic, the parents or extended kin still function as the primary matchmakers. They do the heavy lifting of sourcing, vetting, and presenting candidates.
However, the crucial distinction here is that the individual retains final veto power. If the parents present a prospective spouse and the individual feels absolutely no potential for connection or compatibility, they can reject the match.
And then the parents just have to resume the search. So the individual has a voice, but the options are highly curated by the family.
Finally, we reach the C, the cooperative traditional pattern. This is a highly collaborative effort. The young person might independently meet someone they're interested in and present them to their parents for vetting.
Or the parents might suggest a candidate, and all parties engage in a mutual evaluation.
Right.
But the defining characteristic here, and you really must remember this distinction for the exam, is that parental consent remains an absolute moral, cultural, and often financial necessity.
Exactly. Even if the couple essentially chooses one another, the marriage simply will not materialize without the explicit blessing and structural integration of the wider family units.
That TMC spectrum perfectly illustrates how arranged marriages are adapting. But the blurring of lines goes both ways, doesn't it?
It definitely does. When we analyze so-called love marriages in rapidly modernizing societies like Turkey or India, they rarely resemble the isolated, purely individualistic unions we see in the West.
Right. Even when a young couple in Mumbai or Istanbul falls deeply in love and initiates their own courtship, the surrounding collectivist culture instantly asserts itself. The families will subject the partner to intense scrutiny, evaluating their background, educational pedigree, religious adherence, and earning potential just as rigorously as they would in an arranged match.
Furthermore, the financial and logistical entanglement is immense. In these cultures, families typically finance elaborate wedding ceremonies, they provide initial housing for the newlyweds, or they serve as the primary childcare providers when offspring arrive.
Consequently, a couple might consider themselves to be in a modern love marriage, but the day-to-day reality of their relationship operates under the heavy oversight, support, and enmeshment characteristic of a traditional arranged marriage.
Which brings us to a massive methodological hurdle and the focus of Section 2 of our study session today.
Yeah, because if the fundamental structures, expectations, and familial boundaries of these marriages are so wildly disparate, how do psychological researchers objectively measure if a marriage is happy or successful?
You can't just hand an American and an Indian the exact same survey and expect the answers to mean the same thing.
No, you really can't.
Yeah.
That methodological challenge requires us to utilize one of the most robust frameworks in developmental psychology, which is Yuri Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory.
If you want to understand how researchers dissect a marriage, you really have to understand Bronfenbrenner.
I find it easiest to conceptualize Bronfenbrenner's theory by imagining a set of Russian nesting dolls. You have distinct, interacting systems layered inside one another, all exerting pressure on the individuals at the center.
Let's carefully construct these nested systems for everyone listening. The innermost, smallest doll represents the individual level. When a researcher focuses their inquiry here, they are examining the personal, internal psychological state of the person toward their partner.
Are they experiencing passionate romantic love? Do they have a secure or anxious attachment style? Is there a baseline of fundamental trust? This level is entirely focused on subjective emotional weather.
Then, we take that innermost doll and place it inside the middle doll, which represents the relational level. We are zooming out from internal emotions to observe the actual mechanics of the partnership.
How does this dyad function in reality? We look at the division of labor. Who is managing the household finances? Who is responsible for domestic chores? We examine their decision-making protocols.
And crucially, we analyze their conflict generation and resolution styles. When they disagree, do they utilize healthy compromise, or does one partner utilize coercive control while the other withdraws?
Finally, both the individual and relational dolls are placed inside the outermost largest doll, the environmental level. This is where cross-cultural research gets incredibly complex.
At this level, we are evaluating the relationship between the married couple and their broader social ecosystem. What is the emotional and logistical proximity to their families of origin? How frequently are they interacting with their in-laws?
Are the boundaries surrounding the couple highly permeable, allowing extended family to weigh in on daily decisions? Or are they rigid and isolated?
Therefore, when a psychologist attempts to quantify marital satisfaction, they cannot simply isolate the innermost doll and ask, "Are you currently feeling romantic love?"
Right, because a marriage might possess immense passion at the individual level, but feature a toxic, highly combative relational level and suffer from an intrusive, hostile environmental level. To get an accurate picture, researchers need instruments that capture data across all these nested systems.
Which leads us directly to the specific instrument utilized in the Matafil and Benshoff study. The characteristics of marriage inventory, commonly referred to as the charisma inventory.
The brilliance of the charisma tool lies in its dual-axis measurement system. It doesn't merely ask a participant to rate their current level of satisfaction with various aspects of their marriage.
No, it requires them to first rate the importance of a specific marital variable and then separately rate their satisfaction with that exact same variable.
That distinction between importance and satisfaction is a critical piece of research methodology. Let's say you survey a couple about their financial wealth. They might report incredibly low satisfaction with their bank account.
But if they also report that financial wealth holds very low importance to their value system, that lack of money is not going to significantly degrade their overall marital happiness.
Conversely, if a participant rates emotional transparency as highly important, but reports low satisfaction with their partner's communication skills, that discrepancy becomes a massive predictor of imminent marital distress.
To memorize the specific variables the charisma inventory measures, we can utilize another mnemonic, LLSF. Think of the phrase, let's learn something fun.
Let's break down the components of LLSF. The first L stands for loving. This cluster of variables measures how deeply the couple values open and honest communication, their agreement on how affection should be expressed, their capacity for mutual respect, their sensitivity to one another's needs, and their ability to practice forgiveness after a conflict.
It captures the warmth and interpersonal attunement of the relationship. The second L stands for loyal. This factor assesses a very different set of priorities. It measures the level of consensus between the partners, their dedication to a lifetime commitment, interpersonal fidelity, adherence to strong moral values, and notably, maintaining a sufficiently high level of sexual activity to sustain the marital bond.
And when we view the loyal factor through our cultural framework, we have to remember that in collectivist societies, loyalty isn't merely the absence of infidelity. It is frequently elevated as the supreme moral virtue.
Yes. It represents a steadfast, unbreakable commitment to maintaining the structural integrity of the union, regardless of internal emotional fluctuations or external hardships.
Moving to the S, we have shared values. This cluster evaluates how effectively conflicts are managed, the couple's alignment regarding traditional gender roles within the home, and the priority they place on shared religiosity and unified approaches to parenting and child rearing.
And lastly, the F stands for finances. This factor specifically looks at the couple's level of financial comfort, their ability to maintain financial independence, and crucially, their lack of debt.
There is a vital methodological footnote regarding the finances factor that you need to highlight in your notes. The original, purely Western version of the charisma inventory only included 3 factors: loving, loyal, and shared values.
The researchers had to explicitly engineer and append the finances factor to the scale in order to utilize it accurately for this specific cross-cultural study involving Indian participants.
The rationale behind that addition is fascinating. The source material emphasizes that for Indian couples, achieving financial security and maintaining a strict, rigorous avoidance of credit debt are not just practical economic strategies. They are core cultural and moral imperatives.
Historically, many Indians were socialized to only acquire goods they could purchase outright with liquid cash. The widespread use of credit cards and revolving debt is a relatively modern introduction to that society.
Consequently, operating in debt isn't merely viewed as a financial stressor. It is often internalized as a profound moral failing or a source of deep familial shame. The researchers recognize that evaluating marital satisfaction in an Indian context without explicitly measuring their alignment on financial values would yield fundamentally flawed data.
It is a textbook example of why psychologists cannot simply transplant a Western psychometric tool into an Eastern cultural context without aggressively recalibrating it to reflect localized value systems.
With our theoretical frameworks established and our understanding of how these variables are quantified using the LLSF mnemonic, we are fully equipped to dissect the empirical data. This brings us to Section 3 of our deep dive into the source material, the India versus U.S. showdown.
We are looking closely at the 2008 study conducted by Matafil and Benshoff. The structural design of this study is excellent because it isolates the variables by comparing 3 highly distinct demographic groups, rather than settling for a simple 2-group binary.
Let's define the 3 cohorts. Group 1 is designated as AI India. This cohort consists of Asian Indians who are in traditional arranged marriages and are currently residing in India. The sample size here was 229 individuals.
Group 2 is designated as AIUS. This cohort also consists of Asian Indians in traditional arranged marriages, but these individuals have immigrated and are currently residing in the United States. This group comprised 185 individuals.
Finally, Group 3 is U.S. choice. This cohort consists of American citizens who are in free choice, romantically driven love marriages residing in the United States. This group included 173 individuals.
So we have a robust total sample approaching 600 participants. The researchers administered the adapted charisma inventory to all three groups, meticulously mapping both their perceived importance of and their reported satisfaction with the LLSF variables.
So let's analyze the data regarding importance first. What did these disparate groups prioritize in a marriage?
The cultural divide emerged exactly as our framework predicted. Both of the Indian cohorts, regardless of whether they lived in India or the United States, rated shared values and finances as significantly more important to the foundation of their marriage than the U.S. choice cohort did.
Which perfectly aligns with the collectivist versus individualist models. The Indian groups were focused on the symphony orchestra. They recognize that shared moral values and concrete financial stability are the structural requirements necessary to keep the broader family unit functioning harmoniously.
Exactly. While the U.S. choice group is focused on the solo artist, so it stands to reason that they place slightly less emphasis on those utilitarian structural components compared to interpersonal emotional fulfillment.
However, the data revealed a highly intriguing gender discrepancy within the U.S. choice group regarding the importance of loyalty. The American women in love marriages rated loyalty as a significantly more vital component of the marriage than their American husbands did.
The researchers offered an interesting hypothesis for this variance. They noted that the U.S. choice cohort skewed slightly older on average. It's highly probable that the American men in this specific demographic harbored more traditional gender role expectations and interpreted the survey statements regarding loyalty and commitment through a different lens than their wives.
It serves as a stark reminder that even within a union based purely on romantic choice, husbands and wives might be operating with fundamentally misaligned priorities regarding their core commitments.
But the analysis of importance is really just the preamble. The critical data emerges when we look at their actual reported satisfaction with their marriages. Who ultimately was thriving the most?
The results of this study completely upend the dominant Western cultural narrative. The data showed that the individuals who exercised total free choice in selecting their spouses, U.S. choice group, the cohort that married explicitly and exclusively for romantic love, were consistently the least satisfied with their marriages across the measured variables.
I want to make sure that data point is perfectly clear for you. The cohort operating under the Western ideal of free choice, romantic marriage, reported significantly lower overall marital satisfaction than the cohorts operating under the supposedly oppressive system of arranged marriage.
It's a staggering finding. So among the arranged marriage cohorts who reported the highest levels of satisfaction,
the absolute highest satisfaction scores, dominating nearly every single metric on the inventory, belonged to the AIUS group. The Asian Indians who were in arranged marriages but were currently living in the United States, they reported higher satisfaction than the Americans living in America and higher satisfaction than the Indians living in India.
we have to unpack the underlying mechanics of this outcome. Why did the AIUS cohort achieve such profound marital success?
To explain this phenomenon, we can formulate what we'll call the best of both worlds hypothesis. And to truly grasp it, we must return to Bronfenbrenner's outermost nesting ball, the environmental level, which dictates the couple's relationship with their extended social and familial ecosystem.
When we look at the demographic data regarding living arrangements, the contrast is massive. In the AI India group, the couples living in India, 34% of the participants reported having extended family members living with them permanently in the same household.
That represents an extreme level of familial enmeshment. You are not just navigating a relationship with your spouse, you are constantly negotiating space, resources, and boundaries with your mother-in-law, your father-in-law, and potentially various siblings and extended relatives, all under a single roof.
Now contrast that with the AIUS group. Because they immigrated to the United States, only 6% of them reported having extended family living in their household. The act of immigration created a massive geographical barrier between the couple and that intricate, highly demanding web of extended family oversight.
This is where the best of both worlds synthesis solidifies. The AIUS couples enter into an arranged marriage, meaning their union benefits from all the deep structural stability of a traditional collectivist match.
Right. They have undergone rigorous background matching. They possess deeply aligned moral and financial values, and they carry the profound psychological reassurance that their broader family networks completely support and endorse their union.
But crucially, because they reside in the United States, they are entirely liberated from the day-to-day friction, the micromanagement, and the intrusive surveillance of the extended family.
If they experience a marital conflict, they must resolve it themselves. The mother-in-law is not sitting in the adjacent room ready to intervene and escalate the tension.
This geographical isolation acts as a massive psychological catalyst. Stripped of their immediate, comprehensive social support network, the couple is forced to turn inward and rely almost exclusively on one another for emotional regulation, problem-solving, and daily companionship.
And this intense dyadic reliance actually accelerates and deepens their psychological intimacy. They manage to secure the rock-solid, structurally sound foundation of a traditional arranged marriage, while simultaneously enjoying the privacy, autonomy, and concentrated interpersonal focus typical of a Western love marriage.
It is an incredibly potent structural configuration for long-term success, and it forces us to ask some uncomfortable questions. The data implies that the high failure rate of Western love marriages might not be caused by the presence of romantic love, but by the complete absence of structural communal support.
Conversely, the friction often found in traditional arranged marriages might not stem from the arrangement itself, but from the overwhelming, suffocating presence of the extended family ecosystem. The AIUS group manages to perfectly thread the needle between those two extremes.
That hypothesis provides incredible insight into how environmental factors dictate internal relationship dynamics. Let's pivot geographically and conceptually to Section 4, the Turkish family life cycle. We are going to analyze Nuran Hortaksu's incredibly detailed 2007 study.
Turkey is arguably one of the most fascinating environments on the planet for cross-cultural psychological research. Historically, Turkey is deeply rooted in a collectivist, patriarchal, and Islamic tradition that heavily prioritizes family-initiated, arranged marriages, valuing stability and family honor above individual preference.
However, for over a century, Turkey has simultaneously been undergoing a massive systemic push toward westernization, secularization, and aggressive modernization. You have an intense, ongoing cultural collision.
The modern media apparatus, like television, cinema, the internet, is relentlessly broadcasting Western ideals, emphasizing romantic love, egalitarian partnerships, and individualistic self-fulfillment. Meanwhile, vast sectors of the society remain deeply tethered to traditional collectivist norms.
Because of this unique sociocultural friction, Turkey is a society where both paradigms, the traditional family-initiated arranged marriage and the modern couple-initiated love marriage, coexist simultaneously, often within the same communities or even the same extended families.
Hortaksu's study capitalized on this environment brilliantly. The scale of the research is impressive. They surveyed 430 distinct couples, yielding data from 860 individuals. Within that sample, 159 couples were in traditional arranged marriages, and 244 couples were in free-choice love marriages.
But the true methodological genius of Hortaksu's work is the cross-sectional design. They didn't limit their scope to newlyweds, which often skews data toward the honeymoon phase. They actively categorized the couples across 5 distinct stages of the family life cycle.
They evaluated couples who were currently childless, couples actively raising preschool-aged children, couples with primary school children, couples navigating adolescence, and older couples whose children had reached adulthood.
This framework allows us to observe a moving picture of marital evolution, tracking how these vastly different relationship structures react to the compounding stress of time and child-rearing. Before we analyze their satisfaction levels, we need to establish the baseline demographic differences between the two groups.
The demographic profiles were sharply divergent and perfectly mirrored the traditional versus modern cultural divide. The cohorts in arranged marriages generally possessed lower levels of formal education. They entered into marriage at a significantly younger age. They produced a higher average number of children.
Furthermore, there was a substantially wider gap in both age and education level between the husband and the wife, a demographic structure that classically reinforces male dominance and power imbalances within a patriarchal framework.
Conversely, the couples in choice marriages typically held higher levels of education, delayed marriage until they were older, chose to have fewer children, and exhibited much greater parity between the husband and wife regarding both age and educational attainment.
Keeping those foundational differences firmly in mind, let's examine the initial snapshot. When we analyze couples in the earliest stages of the life cycle, primarily the childless couples, which model produce superior psychological outcomes.
During the early stages, the data heavily favored the love marriages. Couples in choice marriages, and the women in particular, reported experiencing significantly deeper positive emotional feelings toward their spouses. They exhibited much lower rates of insecure attachment, indicating a higher baseline of interpersonal trust and emotional safety.
In terms of relational mechanics, the early-stage love marriages were markedly more egalitarian. The husbands in these choice marriages reported actively participating in domestic labor, sharing the burden of cooking, cleaning, and daily household management.
Furthermore, when we look at Bronfenbrenner's environmental doll, the love marriage couples maintained much healthier boundaries. They possessed greater autonomy from their families of origin, experienced less overarching enmeshment, and consequently reported far less conflict generated by extended family interference.
If a researcher only looked at the first 5 years of the data, the conclusion would be unequivocal. Western-style love marriages are vastly superior, psychologically healthier, and significantly more beneficial, particularly for women.
But the study tracked the entire life cycle, and here is where the narrative shifts dramatically. As these couples progressed through the decades, transitioning from childless newlyweds to parents of preschoolers and eventually to parents of adolescents, the trajectory of the two marriage types did not remain parallel.
The data revealed a fascinating phenomenon. Over time, the operational realities of the two types of marriages actually converged.
The concept of convergence here is critical. Let's analyze the trajectory of the love marriages first. They initiated the relationship with high passion, egalitarian ideals, and shared domestic responsibilities.
However, as the intense, grinding demands of child-rearing were introduced to the system, particularly as the children reached primary school and adolescence, the progressive division of labor began to deteriorate.
The data demonstrated that the husbands in the love marriages progressively withdrew from domestic responsibilities as the family expanded. Despite their initial egalitarian behavior, they largely reverted to traditional patriarchal gender roles once the systemic pressures of raising children intensified.
Concurrently, the reported levels of relational conflict within the love marriages actually increased as time progressed.
Now let's contrast that with the trajectory of the arranged marriages across that exact same life cycle.
In the arranged marriages, the reported level of relational conflict did not increase. It actually declined steadily over time.
Let's apply some psychological theory to explain this divergence. If we analyze the genesis of these relationships, the pattern makes logical sense. Individuals entering an arranged marriage typically experience an incredibly brief courtship phase.
They engage in minimal premarital self-disclosure and often enter the union with a highly limited understanding of their new spouse's personality, triggers, or habits.
Because they lack that extensive premarital vetting period, they enter the living arrangement with virtually no established protocols for dyadic conflict resolution. The initial years of an arranged marriage are likely characterized by high friction as two relative strangers attempt to merge their lives.
However, because they operate within a framework that demands absolute permanence, supported by massive familial pressure to sustain the union, they are forced to actively develop those conflict management skills. Over the span of a decade or two, they adapt, they learn to negotiate, and consequently, the daily conflict diminishes.
By contrast, couples in a love marriage typically engage in a prolonged courtship. During this phase, both individuals are highly motivated to present idealized versions of themselves. They feel deeply compatible and heavily infatuated.
However, this romantic baseline does not necessarily equip them with the specific psychological tools required to navigate the relentless compounding stressors of dual-income child-rearing over a 20-year period. As the romance fades and the logistical stress peaks, their latent incompatibilities emerge and their conflict levels rise.
It is a remarkable convergence. But to fully grasp the profound psychological distress uncovered in the Turkish study, specifically regarding the women, we must introduce the cognitive concept of schemas.
A schema is a fundamental concept in cognitive psychology. Essentially, a schema is an internalized mental framework, a structural blueprint that helps a human brain organize, interpret, and predict the world. It is your subconscious expectation of how a specific system, like a marriage, is fundamentally supposed to operate.
Historically, within a traditional Turkish context, the prevailing schema for marriage was highly utilitarian. The blueprint dictated that marriage was a functional institution, designed to produce legitimate offspring, perpetuate the family lineage, and execute rigidly defined gender roles.
The husband's primary function was to generate external resources and provide security. The wife's primary function was to manage the domestic sphere and rear the children. Deep emotional intimacy or egalitarian partnership might be considered a fortunate bonus, but they were absolutely not core requirements of the schema.
However, the rapid modernization of Turkey meant that an entirely new schema was being aggressively broadcast into the culture. Media, films, and literature began promoting a Western blueprint that insisted a legitimate marriage must be defined by intense romantic passion, deep psychological intimacy, and a perfectly egalitarian division of labor.
The introduction of this competing blueprint generated a massive psychological crisis, specifically for the wives residing within traditional arranged marriages. Ortaksu's data revealed that these specific women reported feeling the highest levels of deprivation and the lowest levels of overall satisfaction. Why did they feel so miserable?
They were miserable because their cognitive frameworks had shifted. These women had internalized the new, modern schema of what a marriage should be. They were observing their peers in modern love marriages, or watching media depictions of husbands who engaged in emotional dialogue and shared household chores.
They then evaluated their own functional, traditional, arranged marriages against this newly adopted, highly romanticized standard, and unsurprisingly, they felt profoundly unfulfilled and shortchanged.
But the true tragedy of this dynamic and the source of massive marital dysfunction lay in the fact that while the wives had rapidly adopted this new modern schema, their husbands in the arranged marriages had absolutely not altered their cognitive blueprints.
The husbands were still operating entirely on the traditional utilitarian schema. They continued to value their wives primarily through the lens of motherhood and domestic management. And crucially, because these husbands were successfully fulfilling their traditional mandate to provide financial security for the family, they assumed the marriage was functioning perfectly.
The empirical data captured this disconnect flawlessly. The surveys showed that the husbands in arranged marriages consistently and falsely reported that their wives were highly satisfied with the division of labor. The husband's internal logic was essentially, I am generating income, she is managing the children, the system is operating according to the traditional blueprint, therefore she must be content.
Meanwhile, the wives are filling out the exact same survey indicating, I am burdened with all the domestic labor, he refuses to participate in the household, he lacks emotional depth, and I am desperately unhappy.
This represents a catastrophic breakdown in fundamental communication. These two individuals were sharing a household, but they were literally evaluating their relationship using two entirely incompatible blueprints of what a marriage was structurally designed to achieve.
It forces us to ask a deeply unsettling question when analyzing relationship dissatisfaction. Are you truly unhappy because your partnership is objectively toxic? Or are you unhappy because external cultural messaging has convinced you to adopt a schema that your specific relationship was never architecturally designed to fulfill?
That is a phenomenal psychological insight, and it provides a perfect bridge to our final piece of literature for this session. Let's move to Section 5, the Indian American phenomenon. We are examining the 2012 study authored by Reagan, LaCompal, and Anguiano.
While the sample size of this particular study is smaller, the metrics it focuses on and the results it generated are incredibly sharp. The researchers evaluated 58 Indian adults currently residing in the United States. Within this cohort, 28 individuals were participating in traditional arranged marriages, while 30 individuals were participating in free-choice love marriages.
Unlike the previous studies that evaluated relational mechanics like chore distribution or environmental factors like in-law conflict, this study utilized a laser focus on the innermost Russian nesting doll. They were exclusively interested in quantifying the internal, subjective, emotional state of the participants.
Specifically, the researchers measured 4 core emotional metrics: passionate love, companionate love, overall satisfaction, and commitment.
To clarify the psychological terminology, passionate love refers to the intense, highly volatile emotional state, the physiological arousal, the intense longing for union, the obsessive cognitive focus on the partner.
Companionate love, by contrast, is the deep, enduring, steady affection based on profound mutual trust, shared history, and the abiding feeling that you are fundamentally safe with this person.
The researchers ran the statistical analysis on these 58 Indian Americans, directly comparing the internal emotional landscapes of those in arranged marriages against those in love marriages. The results heavily contradict established assumptions.
The data revealed absolutely no statistically significant differences between the individuals in arranged marriages and those in love-based marriages across any of those emotional metrics. None.
Given Western biases, you would logically hypothesize that the love marriage cohort would score exponentially higher on the passionate love metric at the bare minimum.
The assumption is that arranged marriages might foster commitment, but lack passion. But the data proved otherwise. Both groups scored extraordinarily high across the entire board.
On a scale ranging from 1 to 9, the mean scores for both cohorts clustered tightly between 7.5 and 8.9. Regardless of how the marriage was initiated, almost everyone in the study reported being profoundly happy, deeply committed, and intensely in love.
As students of psychology, when we encounter a study where nearly every participant in every cohort scores at the absolute apex of the measurement scale, we must immediately recognize the statistical phenomenon occurring. What are we observing here?
We're observing what statisticians call a ceiling effect.
Let's clearly define the ceiling effect for the exam, because it is a critical concept in psychometric testing. Imagine you are tasked with evaluating the mathematical proficiency of a group of advanced college engineering students.
However, the test you administer consists entirely of elementary addition problems like 2 plus 2 or 5 plus 5. Every single engineering student is going to score exactly 100%.
Right. And because everyone effortlessly hits the absolute ceiling of the testing instrument, the resulting data is functionally useless for determining who the actual best mathematician in the room is. The test lacks the difficulty required to expose the natural variance within the population. If researchers wanted to fix that ceiling effect, they would have to administer a calculus exam to spread the scores out.
In the Regan study, because the vast majority of participants, regardless of marriage type, reported being highly satisfied and deeply in love, the data slammed into the top of the 9-point scale, creating a ceiling effect.
It rendered it statistically impossible for the researchers to detect any nuanced minor variances in emotional depth between the arranged and love marriage cohorts. They were all simply maxing out the instrument.
However, despite the limitations imposed by the ceiling effect, the researchers did uncover one highly unexpected, statistically significant variance within the data. And the variance was not found between the different types of marriage. It was found between the genders.
Let's examine that gender divergence.
Within this specific study of Indian Americans, the men reported significantly higher levels of total commitment, passionate love, and companionate love than the women did.
That finding aggressively contradicts almost every prevailing Western stereotype regarding gender and romance. Western media consistently socializes us to believe that women are the inherently romantic, emotionally invested, love-driven partners within a union, while men are depicted as the stoic, practical, emotionally detached participants.
What psychological mechanism explains why these Indian American men were reporting vastly higher levels of passionate and companionate love?
The researchers attribute this variance to a specific psychological trait known as romanticism.
We need to define that term accurately, because in a psychological context, romanticism does not mean buying chocolates or planning extravagant dates.
In psychology, romanticism is defined as an adherence to a specific set of highly idealized cognitive beliefs regarding love. It encompasses the belief that every individual has one true soulmate, the belief in the phenomenon of love at first sight, and the deep conviction that true love can conquer any and all external obstacles.
And when you review the broader psychological literature, a fascinating pattern emerges. Generally speaking, men consistently score higher on psychometric scales measuring romanticism than women do.
Women, conversely, are often socialized to approach mate selection with a much higher degree of pragmatism. From a sociological standpoint, this makes perfect sense. Historically, a woman's physical survival, economic stability, and social standing were almost entirely dependent on the specific man she married.
She literally could not afford the luxury of following a purely emotional impulse blindly. Men, who historically held the majority of systemic and economic power, possessed the safety net required to indulge in starry-eyed, idealized romanticism.
That sociological perspective is crucial. But if we integrate this finding with our earlier discussion regarding collectivist morality, an even deeper layer of analysis emerges.
Within traditional patriarchal cultures, a man might conceptualize his deep structural commitment, his unwavering loyalty, and his relentless labor to provide resources for his family, not as a tedious burden, but as a profound moral and passionate duty.
I think that is the key insight. When an Indian American man in this cohort takes a survey asking him to quantify his level of passionate love and commitment to his spouse, he is likely evaluating his own successful execution of that sacred moral duty.
His extraordinarily high scores on the passionate and companionate love metrics might be a direct reflection of his fierce, uncompromising dedication to his designated role as the protector and provider of the family unit. He experiences that structural duty as a profound form of love.
It brilliantly illustrates how culturally subjective these internal psychological constructs truly are. When an American woman marks a 9 out of 9 on a commitment scale, her internal translation might be, I feel entirely emotionally fulfilled and validated by this individual.
But when a traditional Indian man marks a 9 out of 9 on the exact same scale, his internal translation might be, I will fulfill my sacred moral duty to my ancestors to protect, provide for, and sustain this family unit at all costs. The number on the page is identical, but the psychological architecture supporting it is vastly different.
We have meticulously covered a massive expanse of data and theory today. Let's briefly synthesize the core concepts of this deep dive into the source material so that our frameworks are rock solid for the exam.
We initiated the session by utilizing Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory, conceptualizing marriage as a series of Russian nesting dolls. We established that you cannot accurately evaluate a partnership by solely analyzing the individual's emotional state. You must rigorously examine the relational mechanics and the overarching environmental pressures exerted by the extended family system.
We then explored the charisma inventory, utilizing our LLSF mnemonic. Let's learn something fun. We defined the variables of loving, loyal, shared values, and finances, placing special emphasis on the fact that researchers explicitly added the financial metric because operating in credit debt represents a profound moral failing within many collectivist cultures.
Analyzing the Matathil and Benshaw study, we observed that the cohort embodying the Western ideal of free choice, romantic marriage, the U.S. choice group, actually reported the lowest overall marital satisfaction.
The zenith of marital satisfaction belonged to the AI-US cohort. Asian Indians engaged in arranged marriages but residing in the United States. This group optimized the best of both worlds hypothesis. They secured the structural stability, vetted compatibility, and shared values of a traditional match, while utilizing geographical distance to eliminate the daily friction of extended family enmeshment.
Moving to Hortaxu's Turkish study, we tracked how marriages converge across the family life cycle. We saw that while love marriages often initiate with high egalitarianism and passion, the compounding stress of child-rearing frequently causes husbands to revert to traditional gender roles, resulting in increased relational conflict.
Conversely, arranged marriages often begin with friction due to a lack of premarital intimacy, but the structural permanence forces the couple to develop robust conflict resolution skills, leading to a decline in conflict over time.
We also analyzed how the infiltration of modern media schemas caused traditional Turkish wives to feel acute deprivation, while their husbands, operating on older schemas, remained oblivious to the dysfunction.
Finally, we analyzed the Regan study of Indian Americans encountering the statistical ceiling effect, where participants across both marriage models reported maximum levels of love and satisfaction.
This study also highlighted the surprising reality that men often score higher on psychological metrics of romanticism and commitment, largely because they frequently internalize their protective and provisionary duties as profound expressions of passionate love.
The overarching synthesis derived from these diverse sources is unambiguous. Whether your partnership is initiated through serendipitous romantic attraction or meticulously engineered by your parents utilizing a spreadsheet of familial backgrounds and economic assets, the long-term viability and success of the relationship relies immensely on the surrounding ecosystem.
Enduring marriages require aligned moral values, structural support, manageable familial boundaries, and the adaptive capacity to manage compounding conflict across the lifespan.
This data systematically dismantles the inherent Western bias. Romantic passion is undoubtedly a powerful human experience, but the empirical evidence clearly demonstrates that it is not the exclusive, nor is it definitively the most reliable foundation upon which to construct a highly satisfying, structurally sound, and morally grounded life partnership.
Which leaves me with a final, slightly provocative hypothesis for you to analyze before we conclude this study session. I want you to reconsider the mechanics of that highly successful AI-US cohort.
They achieved the absolute highest levels of satisfaction because they capitalized on the structural integrity and shared moral framework provided by a family-arranged match, but they simultaneously utilized immigration to secure the geographical independence typical of a Western love marriage.
They leveraged the communal foundation to build the house, but they ensured they had the private space to inhabit it on their own terms.
So if we extrapolate from that data, does this suggest that the ultimate empirically validated recipe for long-term human relational happiness is essentially a village that carefully constructs your foundation, rigorously matches your core values, and structurally supports your union, but then is forced to actively step back and allow you to live in an entirely different time zone?
That is a highly compelling interpretation of the environmental data.
Furthermore, it forces us to ask, are we, operating within the highly individualistic West, placing an unsustainable, psychologically crushing amount of pressure on the concept of romantic love?
Are we demanding that a single, highly volatile emotion, passion, perform all the heavy, structural, load-bearing work that extended community, familial oversight, and shared moral covenants successfully managed for the preceding 50,000 years of human history?
If your cultural blueprint demands that your spouse simultaneously function as your passionate lover, your primary intellectual confidant, your exclusive financial partner, and your sole emotional support network, you are creating an architectural structure uniquely prone to collapse.
That immense pressure is likely the exact mechanism driving the high conflict and comparatively low satisfaction rates we observed in the U.S. choice cohort.
Precisely. It is a critical dynamic to keep in mind the next time you are evaluating the psychological architecture of any relationship.
We want to genuinely thank you for joining us for this extensive deep dive into the source material for today's study session. We hope you found the synthesis of these papers as illuminating as we did.
Best of luck with your midterm preparations. And please remember, at a certain point, you must close the textbooks, step away from the data, and prioritize getting a full night of sleep before your next lecture. Your hippocampus requires it.
We will see you back here at the library for the next session.